Cooper and Trooper, Guardians of the Juniper Mountains, a Western epic of loyalty, survival, and justice. Book 1, The Canyon Mystery. Chapter 1, Signs in the Dust. The Juniper Mountains of northern Arizona stood timeless, carved by wind and sun, where the air carried the scent of earth, pine, and distant rain. Towering juniper trees swayed gently in the desert breeze, their gnarled limbs framing the endless, untamed horizon. Nestled deep within this rugged land sat Scott's ranch, 400 acres of self-reliance, bordered by cliffs, canyons, and desert scrub. Life here was as raw as the land itself, dictated by seasons and instinct. Scott, pushing 60, had spent decades shaping this ranch into a sanctuary. A former rodeo cowboy, his hands were calloused from a lifetime of hard work. But he wasn't alone out here. His two Great Danes, Cooper and Trooper, were as much a part of the land as the rocks and trees. The brothers, towering, black-coated giants with piercing golden eyes and a single patch of white on their chests, were more than just pets. They were guardians, and today, their instincts were screaming that something wasn't right. Scott noticed it first when he was out checking the fence lines. Cooper suddenly froze, his sleek form stiffening like a statue. Trooper, usually restless and eager to chase rabbits, also stopped, his golden eyes locked on something in the distance. Scott followed their gaze. A set of boot prints in the dust. They weren't his. Scott swung his leg off the ATV and crouched, studying the fresh tracks. Someone had been walking along the northern boundary, an area no one had any business being in. His gut told him this wasn't just a lost hiker. And when his gut talked, he listened. He patted Cooper's side. Let's go see who's trespassing. The Danes took off ahead, their powerful legs silent as shadows on the desert floor. Scott climbed back on the ATV and followed. Something told him this wouldn't be just another quiet day on the ranch. Chapter 2, The Vanishing Trail. Scott followed the boot prints for nearly 2 miles. They led deep into the backcountry, where his land sloped into rocky canyons and dense juniper groves. Then, the trail stopped. Scott frowned. The tracks simply vanished. No signs of turning back. No disturbances in the brush. No broken twigs. It was as if the person had walked into thin air. Cooper sniffed the ground, then raised his head sharply, ears twitching. Trooper let out a low, uneasy growl. Scott had spent years living by the land. He knew the difference between an accident and something intentional. This was intentional. Then somewhere in the distance, a gunshot rang through the canyon. Scott ducked instinctively, rifle swinging up. Cooper and Trooper crouched low, their golden eyes locked on the horizon. Silence. Then another shot. Scott exhaled, his fingers tightening around the rifle. Someone was in trouble, and trouble had a way of finding Scott. He climbed onto the ATV. Come on, boys. With the Danes sprinting beside him, he sped toward the sound of gunfire. Chapter 3, The Stranger's Camp. It didn't take long to find it. Nestled against a rock outcropping was a crude camp. A small fire smoldered, its embers glowing faintly in the desert dusk. And beside it, a man slumped against a rock, clutching his bleeding leg. Scott pulled up fast, rifle raised. Don't move. The man's head snapped up. His face was pale, his expression full of exhaustion and weariness. He wasn't alone. Cooper and Trooper flanked Scott, their bodies tense, hackles raised. The man's lips cracked into something like a painful grin. Well, you ain't the first person to aim a rifle at me today. Scott didn't lower his gun. Who shot you? The man hesitated. Couple of fellas. They were trying to make sure I didn't leave here alive. Scott narrowed his eyes. He didn't trust strangers. But something about this man's tone told him he was telling the truth. Scott exhaled. We need to get you patched up? The man winced but nodded. Name's Jesse. Jesse Calloway. Scott didn't react, but he recognized the name. Jesse Calloway was a wanted man. And suddenly Scott realized this was a lot bigger than just a couple of trespassers. Chapter 4, The Midnight Raid. Scott brought Jesse back to the ranch, bandaging his leg and keeping an eye on him. He didn't ask too many questions yet. But that night, Cooper and Trooper refused to sleep. Instead, they stood on the porch, staring toward the dark horizon. Scott had seen that stance before. They were waiting, and sure enough, at midnight, the sound of crunching gravel reached Scott's ears. Already on his feet, rifle in hand, when the first shadow moved between the trees. Scott's jaw tightened. "Looks like your friends found you, Calloway." Jesse, still weak but alert, groaned. "They ain't my friends." Scott stepped onto the porch. 4 men emerged from the dark, rifles in hand. The leader, a thick-set man with a scar down his cheek, smirked. "We just want the boy, old man." Scott cocked his rifle. "Ain't happening." The men exchanged glances. Then, they moved. Scott fired first. The shot echoed through the night, and Cooper and Trooper charged. The battle had begun. Chapter 5, Justice Rides Again. The fight didn't last long. Scott's rifle was fast. The Danes? Faster. Within seconds, 2 of the men were down. One knocked out cold by Cooper's sheer force, the other screaming as Trooper pinned him. The leader and his last man ran. Scott let them. He knew they wouldn't get far. By the time Sheriff Michael Brown arrived at dawn, the men were tied up like cattle, bruised, beaten, and scared out of their wits. The sheriff surveyed the scene, then looked at Scott. "What the hell happened here?" Scott shrugged. "Guess some folks learned not to mess with my ranch." Sheriff Brown turned to Cooper and Trooper, who stood tall, watching everything unfold with their golden eyes. "They're damn good dogs." Scott chuckled, ruffling Trooper's ears. "The best." As the criminals were hauled off, Scott leaned against the porch railing, watching the sun rise over his land. Another day, another fight, and with Cooper and Trooper by his side, he knew no one was ever taking this ranch from him. Not now, not ever. Into Book 1. But Cooper and Trooper's adventures were just beginning. Cooper and Trooper, Guardians of the Juniper Mountains. Book 2, The Ghosts of Coyote Pass. Chapter 1, The Lure of the Forgotten Mine. It had been 3 months since Scott, Cooper, and Trooper had dealt with the men hunting Jesse Calloway. The ranch had returned to its usual quiet rhythm. Early mornings, cattle runs, and long evenings spent on the porch with his dogs. But Scott knew something was coming. It always did. One late afternoon, while riding the ATV along the fence line, Scott noticed a set of strange tire tracks leading into the foothills near Coyote Pass. It wasn't a route anyone used. The old copper mine sat abandoned up there, sealed shut decades ago after a collapse had claimed 3 miners' lives. No one had business being there, and yet the tracks were fresh. Cooper and Trooper paced anxiously beside him, their ears pricked forward. Scott studied the tracks a moment longer. Then he made his decision. "We're checking it out." Chapter 2, The Hidden Entrance. The trail wound through dense juniper groves before disappearing into a narrow canyon. Scott cut the ATV's engine and dismounted. He moved quietly, rifle slung over his shoulder, boots crunching on loose rock. Cooper and Trooper moved ahead, their noses low to the ground. Then, Cooper stopped dead. Scott followed his gaze. Just ahead, nestled between 2 massive boulders, was something he hadn't expected. A makeshift barricade, wooden planks nailed together, blocking the old mine entrance. Scott exhaled. Somebody's been working here. Trooper let out a low growl. Scott ran his fingers over the planks. They were new. Someone had reopened the mine, and they didn't want anyone knowing about it. Scott stepped back, scanning the landscape. Whoever was out here was probably watching him right now. And that meant things were about to get real interesting. Chapter 3, The First Warning. Scott didn't stay long. He had no interest in getting caught up in something unprepared. But the next morning, while heading into town, he noticed something odd. A single bullet casing resting on his front porch. Scott picked it up, turning it over in his fingers. A warning. Cooper sniffed the air, then let out a soft, unsettling growl. Someone had been on his land while he slept. Scott's jaw tightened. The Juniper Mountains had plenty of ghosts, and now someone was trying to create new ones. Chapter 4, Into the Darkness. Scott wasn't about to wait for trouble to find him. By sunset, he and the Danes were back at the mine, rifle in hand, lantern hooked to his belt. He took down the wooden barricade with a few swift swings of his axe. Behind it, the darkness yawned open like a mouth. Scott adjusted his hat, exhaling. "Let's go, boys." With Cooper leading and Trooper close behind, they stepped inside. The air was stale, thick with the scent of dust and something else, something metallic. Then, a sound in the distance. A footstep. Scott froze. Someone else was in the mine, and they weren't alone. Chapter 5, The Chase Underground. Scott moved quickly, lanterns swinging low. The mine tunnel stretched ahead, the walls tight, damp, and uneven. Then another sound, a shuffle of boots. Scott's instincts kicked in. "Come out," he called, voice even. "Ain't no sense hiding." Silence. Then, a shadow moved. Scott barely had time to react before a figure bolted past him toward the exit. But they made a big mistake. They tried to outrun the Danes. Trooper lunged first, slamming into the man's legs. The figure crashed hard onto the rocky floor, letting out a sharp cry of pain. Scott raised his lantern, revealing a young man, filthy, exhausted, eyes full of panic. Scott narrowed his eyes. "Who the hell are you?" The man swallowed hard. "I was trying to get away," he whispered. "You don't understand. They're coming." Chapter 6, The Midnight Attack. Scott barely had time to question the man before gunfire erupted outside. Cooper barked sharply, spinning toward the mine's entrance. Scott killed the lantern and crouched low, pulling the stranger down beside him. "Who's out there?" Scott hissed. The young man shuddered. "The ones who run this mine. I thought it was abandoned, but..." Another gunshot split the silence. Then, footsteps. They were coming inside. Scott exhaled. Time to make a stand. Chapter 7, The Firefight. The first man stepped into the mine, rifle raised. Scott fired first. The shot slammed into the entrance wall, sending shards of rock flying. The man stumbled back, cursing. Scott moved fast, keeping low. "Boys, get him!" Cooper and Trooper sprang into action. Trooper hit one of the gunmen like a freight train, sending the man sprawling. Cooper clamped onto another's wrist, making him scream in pain. Scott took out the last man with a swift rifle, but to the jaw. Within seconds, the fight was over. The gunman lay groaning on the ground, unable to move. Scott exhaled, dusting himself off. "Well," he muttered, "that was easier than I expected." Trooper wagged his tail. Cooper just huffed. Scott turned to the young man. "Now, tell me exactly what's going on here." Chapter 8, The Secret of the Mine. His name was Lucas Kane, and he had stumbled into something dangerous. "I was just looking for shelter," he admitted. "But I found things in that mine. Carts still full of ore. Tools still laid out like someone had just left them." Scott frowned. "You're saying there's still mining?" Lucas nodded. "Illegally." Scott rubbed his jaw. "And they tried to kill you?" "Yeah," Lucas muttered. "Guess they didn't like me poking around." Scott turned his gaze toward the mine's entrance, where the gunman still lay unconscious. He had a feeling this wasn't over. Not by a long shot. Chapter 9, Justice in the Mountains. By dawn, Sheriff Brown was on the scene. The gunmen were hauled away, their illegal mining operation shut down for good. Lucas was safe, and the Juniper Mountains were quiet once more. Scott leaned on his fence post, watching the sheriff's truck disappear down the road. Cooper and Trooper sat beside him, watching like sentinels. Scott sighed, scratching behind Trooper's ears. Can't even check a damn fence line without running into an adventure. Trooper licked his hand. Cooper just wagged his tail. Scott chuckled. "Come on, boys. Let's go home. Another day, another fight." But with Cooper and Trooper by his side, he wasn't worried about what came next. Not one bit. Into Book 2. But Scott, Cooper, and Trooper's adventures were far from over. Cooper and Trooper, Guardians of the Juniper Mountains. Book 3, The Phantom Riders. Chapter 1, Whispers on the Wind. Scott had lived in the Juniper Mountains long enough to know when trouble was coming. It always started with a change in the air, an uneasy silence, a shift in the wind, and the way Cooper and Trooper tensed like they could hear something Scott couldn't. And sure enough, it happened again. It had been a month since he had shut down the illegal mining operation, and life had settled back into its usual rhythm. Fence lines, cattle runs, quiet evenings on the porch. But then strange things started happening. First, it was the cattle. They were nervous, restless. Something was spooking them at night. Then, Scott found hoof prints near the eastern boundary. Deep, heavy tracks, not from any horse he recognized. And finally, one evening, Trooper bolted from the porch, barking like hell was at his heels. By the time Scott caught up, he saw it. A lone rider on the ridge, watching. Then, as quickly as he appeared, he was gone. Scott exhaled. He had a feeling things were about to get real interesting. Chapter 2. The Vanishing Riders. The next morning, Scott rode out early with Cooper and Trooper trotting alongside. The hoof prints led deep into the eastern canyons, winding through old cattle trails and rocky outcrops. Then, suddenly, they disappeared. Scott frowned. The trail had been clear as day, but now, nothing. No tracks. No broken twigs. No signs of anyone turning back. Cooper sniffed the ground, ears twitching. Trooper let out a low, uneasy growl. Scott scanned the horizon, the old cowboy instinct kicking in. Something wasn't right. Then, a gunshot split the silence. Scott barely had time to react before the bullet slammed into a nearby rock, sending shards flying. Instinct took over. Scott rolled behind a boulder, rifle swinging up. Cooper and Trooper flanked him, muscles tense. Someone out here didn't want to be found, and they were willing to kill to stay hidden. Chapter 3. The Outlaw's Warning. Scott waited. Silence stretched across the canyon. Then a voice. "You don't belong here, old man." Scott didn't move. His grip tightened on his rifle. "I own this land," he called back. "That means you don't belong here." A pause. Then another voice, deeper, colder. "We ain't living it." Scott exhaled slowly. They were dug in, and that meant only one thing. He was going to have to dig them out. Chapter 4. The Midnight Raid. Scott didn't sleep much that night. Instead, he watched the ridge, waiting for movement. Cooper and Trooper padded back and forth, restless. Then, just before dawn, they heard it. A distant howl. Then another. But they weren't coyotes. They were men. Scott stood, gripping his rifle as figures on horseback emerged from the darkness. 5. No, 6 riders moving in silent formation. They weren't just outlaws. There was something else. Something worse. Scott exhaled. "Well, boys," he muttered. "Looks like we got company." Cooper bared his teeth. Trooper let out a deep, guttural growl. The battle for the ranch had begun. Chapter 5. Fire in the Night. The first shot came from the ridge. Scott fired back, dropping the lead rider's horse. The bandits scattered, rifles flashing in the dark. Then, Cooper and Trooper charged. The first outlaw barely had time to react before Trooper tackled him, sending him crashing into the dust. Cooper took down another, his massive jaws clamping onto a rifle-wielding man's arm. Scott moved fast, rifle cracking in the night, taking down another. Within minutes, the fight was over. 2 men lay groaning in the dirt. The rest, gone, flooded into the night like ghosts. Scott stood over one of the fallen men, kicking his rifle away. "Who sent you?" The outlaw spat blood, grinning through broken teeth. "You ain't seen nothing yet, cowboy." Scott exhaled, stepping back. "Yeah, we'll see about that." Chapter 6. The Man in Black. Sheriff Brown showed up at sunrise, taking the 2 captured outlaws into custody. "They weren't alone," Scott muttered. "There's more of them out there." Brown nodded. "We've been hearing rumors. A gang move in through the mountains, running stolen horses and worse." Scott narrowed his eyes. "They were organized, trained." Brown sighed. "Word is they got a leader, a man in black. Never seen, only heard about." Scott folded his arms. "Well," he muttered, "he's about to have a problem." Because Scott wasn't just any rancher. And he wasn't alone. Cooper stood tall beside him, ears alert. Trooper wagged his tail, ready for the next fight. Scott smirked. Let him come. Chapter 7. The Storm Breaks. For 3 nights, nothing happened. Then, on the 4th night, Scott woke to the sound of hooves. Lots of them. Cooper and Trooper were already on their feet, hackles raised. Scott grabbed his rifle and stepped onto the porch. And there, lined up in the moonlight, were 10 riders. At the center, a man dressed in black. Scott sighed. Well, boys, he muttered, this is going to be a hell of a night. To be continued. Scott, Cooper, and Trooper's greatest battle is just beginning.